Coming up this week,
we started building out this EV infrastructure by building the autos first, and now we're doing the batteries, and then we're going to the supply chain. So now the OEMs and the battery makers are putting out specs to an industry that doesn't exist.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 174 of the EV Resource Podcast. I'm Zach Hurst, and each week I bring you the latest EV news, information, and interviews with industry experts. And welcome to 2024. Happy New Year to you, your family, and friends. This is going to be a great year. I can just feel it. I am going to have a 2024 predictions show. That is something I'm currently working on, as well as incorporated into that a recap of what happened in the EV industry in 2023 and reviewing some of the predictions that I had at the beginning of last year. Go over and see how accurate my best guesses were. This episode, however, I'm going to speak with a special guest about graphite, which is one of the most important minerals in an EV battery cell. You really can't have them without it. But before we get to the interview, I want to thank Titan Auto and Tire right here in Central Virginia for their support of the podcast. Titan has 3 locations to serve the greater Richmond area, and they are qualified to work on EVs and hybrids. I've been taking all of my vehicles there for years, and I wouldn't recommend anyone else in the local area. And from hybrids to Hummers, they can fix everything. So take your vehicle there. For more information and to schedule an appointment for your vehicle, go to titanautotire.com. My guest today is John DeMaio with Graphex, and I'm really excited to talk with you, John, about just getting into some of the more technical aspects of battery chemistries and why that's important. But before we really jump into the conversation, I always like to give an opportunity to just talk about yourself a little bit, your origin story, where you're coming from, and what led you to where you are now.
Yeah, okay, great. And Zach, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate what you all are doing over at EV Resource. Looking forward. I don't know if you're having a fall festival this year, but those look like they're a lot of fun. So as far as myself goes, I've really been a proponent of electrification, really more about sustainability. And before it was called the energy transition, my background has always been more or less in that space. I started really in mechanical contracting, but with a focus on renewables. I worked on some of the first, not to date myself, but some of the first solar energy generation stations out in the Mojave Desert here in California. Cool. Those were the parabolic troughs with the superheated synthetic oils and molten salt and stuff like that. At the time, we really almost didn't even know what we were working on, but it goes that far back. And then followed up with a lot of, I'll call them waste to energy plants. So although we were working for like LA, Department of Resources and Water and Power, we were working on digester gas, into combined cycle heat recovery type energy generation. And this was really kind of before its time, So always had really an interest in that area. And even going back to when I was a kid, I was an early recycler. I was around, again, dating myself for the first Earth Day and all that. And I really recognized that there's only a finite number of resources on this planet. And as we, continue to evolve technologically, that's going to reach a tipping point, and
sure. Yeah.
From there, I got into, different water, wastewater kind of areas. But again, with a focus on the energy that it takes to do that, most of the energy, for example, in a typical municipality is used moving water around. Again, water, wastewater, et cetera. And then I spent some time at Siemens in their smart infrastructure. I ran the smart infrastructure division, and we focused a lot on energy efficiency, on-site generation, kind of a total energy approach to, again, sustainability. What was common throughout all those experiences is that we knew we were doing, in this case, projects that were benefiting really, the planet and society, but it was always a little bit of an uphill push, right? Because, you have to justify this from a financial basis as well as, an environmental and a sustainability basis. And that's always been met with a lot of kind of resistance from different quadrants, right?
Sure.
how I got into this space is kind of almost a happenstance. I was approached by, in this case, a recruiter, but when you first approached me and it kind of described the opportunity, I said, well, I appreciate, the outlook, but the outreach, but you don't see graphite anywhere in my resume. And the answer came back, well, we don't see graphite in anybody's resume.
Sure.
But we do see your past of like navigating within this kind of a space. So after a little bit more talking, a little bit more convincing, I made the leap. And to your point, well, I'll stop there, and that kind of gets us to where we are today.
Sure. So I want to cover what Graphex is as a company. Mainly, like typically I won't like really dive in at this point to talking about the company itself.
Right.
But in this case, I think that will definitely help give context for the broader conversation that we're going to have. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing what Graphex is, what you all do, and kind of go at it from that angle.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, and I'll speak about it more about not so much the company, but what we do.
Sure.
Because that is who we are. So, in real quick terms, for use in battery chemistries, a lot of attention's always been placed on the cathode side. Right, talks about lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese. What I call the marquee metals or the sexy metals. Right.
Sure.
And they all represent what happens on the cathode or the positive side, the positive anode. And this from your EV experience, but for the folks, the anode, the negative electrode, is primarily and has been since lithium-ion batteries were invented back in the 60s and 70s. It's always been graphite. Now, it could be a combination of synthetic and natural graphite. We focus a lot on the natural graphite side, but the anode side is 95 to 99% graphite, and it makes up the largest component by volume in a lithium-ion electric vehicle battery. So it accounts for 25, maybe 28% of the volume by weight. In a battery, can be up to 15 times more graphite than lithium in a battery. So that I'll get to the point about what you asked, which is what we do. So the graphite that goes into an electric vehicle battery is what we'll call refined graphite, right? The graphite that comes out of the ground, in the case of natural, is an ore, right? It comes out of the ground anywhere from 3% to maybe as high as 17 or even 20% of carbon content in the ore itself. The mining operations will take that, concentrate it to about 95% carbon content, right? So we receive that material. We don't do the mining. We do the so we'll take 95% carbon content material, powder, basically. We will refine that to 99.95 purity and also put a spherical shape on it, or as close to spherical as we can. So we call that process shaping and purification. What a surprise, right? At that point, that material is capable of being a battery anode material, not necessarily for electric vehicles. That material called shaped and purified graphite can be used in power tools, consumer electronics, some of your applications that don't require long cycle times and cycle lives. So we take that shaped and purified graphite, we then put it through a pitch coating process where we coat each particle with a microscopic layer of basically asphalt. And that gives it the anti-swelling characteristics that are required for use in electric. So we do the shaping, purifying, and coating of natural graphite. That's our kind of claim to fame. And that's where the end of the field we play in. The last thing I'll say about that, from a performance basis and a commercial value basis, what we do is where most of the value is added in the graphite food chain.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, getting the materials ready to be used in that, whatever that next step is, obviously is important, whether you're talking about graphite or really anything else.
Correct.
Before we get further along, the one question that pops into my head as you're saying that is, what's next? Once you guys have done all of that, what then happens, and who else, if it's other companies, are involved in kind of the process where eventually we will have batteries that are used in consumer products.
Right. So our product is, our finished product basically then becomes a raw material for the cell manufacturers, the battery cell manufacturers. And that will include the names, most names people know, CATL, one of the largest in the world. But here domestically, we have, well, again, they're foreign companies that are now on American soil, and some of them now being Americanized, but LG, SK, Samsung, et cetera, Panasonic, in the case of Tesla. So most of the OEM car manufacturers have, if they don't have their own battery division, which many of them don't, they will connect with and joint venture with proven battery manufacturers. So our product goes in, we sell, if you will, our graphite powder, shaped, purified, coated, to cell manufacturers or OEMs for use by the cell manufacturers. They will then take that and create the anode material, the anodes using that material and maybe some other additives, right? So that's where the chemistry, the magic of putting together their specific recipes for their battery configurations will happen. Your basic components that are available for use on the anode side, typically natural graphite. I mentioned synthetic graphite. Then you have different forms of silicon oxides. You might have lithium titanium oxide. A small percentage can be made up of those, we'll call them additives. Now, why you hear about silicon a lot is it's, graphite, the performance that warrants its use, since again, the invention of the battery, it's the ability to store the charge and allow for the discharge, to stay relatively inert, stable, et cetera. And it's a natural product, obviously, and fairly available, right? Silicon is a very good conductor. Silicon is an excellent conductor, right? Obviously, for all of its use in the semiconductor business.
Yeah.
The problem with silicon is that it swells upon charge and discharge to about 400% of its original volume. And that creates, obviously, problems within a confined space like a battery pack. If you think about a battery cell, and there are different form factors, but in a lot of cases, we're talking about what looks like an overgrown flashlight battery. The jelly roll configuration, that cylindrical, exactly. Picture that at, maybe 6 inches tall and, inch and a half wide. There'll be 800 to, 1,800 of those, or even more if you think about like an electric Hummer. But you have 1,000 or more of these things. If each one of them swells a little bit, you've got a problem on your hands, right? So silicon, for all of its positive characteristics, it's got that one really, kind of detrimental drawback. And there are a lot of R&D dollars being spent to see if silicon can be the quote unquote replacement, for graphite on the anode side. And there'll be, weight. Graphite can be heavy, right? If you can lower that weight by a lot, it's one of the holy grails of EVs. It's not on the horizon in the short term that anybody can see, right? It's a long-term goal, but for anyone who's been around in this arena, let's say, I'll just speak real briefly about solar. 15 years ago, when I was focused on solar, we were always complaining that panels were only 19%, 20% efficient, and someone's going to figure out how to make these things 75% efficient. Well, that hasn't happened yet.
Right.
So there are certain limitations, that are inevitable or that need to be addressed. So, as far as the use of different materials on the anode side, again, there are a lot of battery chemists out there that are manipulating the ratio between natural and synthetic on an anode, the percentage of silicon additives and other additives, et cetera. And at the same time, also considering what's on the cathode side, what they're using for electrolytes. So there are, a multitude of variations that they look at. What's nice for us is that it always includes graphite on the anode side.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with a lot of the innovations, like even solid state batteries that I know a number of companies have been working for it feels like many, many, many years to try to figure out how to make that work at scale. Even then, a solid state battery is essentially replacing the electrolyte and the cathode side of things, where the anode effectively is still the same.
It's
So,
the same.
y-
Yeah.
y-
And that yeah, exactly. And that's, there will be advancements. There always are, right? There's a lot of work to be done with the battery management systems, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, and there are a lot of folks focused on the anode side as well as the cathode side. But not to say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But again, it's been in use for 50 years. Even if there is a transition, it's going to take a while, if not a
sure.
long while, for that to be proven at scale, to be economical, and then to be adopted, by the users.
Mhm.
There's enough moving parts right now for the OEMs to figure out, how to make the electric vehicle marketplace work effectively, and then all of the infrastructure that supports it. Right? There's several areas that, again, if it's not broke, they're not really looking to fix it just yet, right? There's
Mhm.
plenty of graphite on the planet, right? It's a natural product. It's not facing the same kind of concerns, as far as scarcity that lithium and nickel and cobalt and that kind of thing are. So again, it's not the area of focus for an immediate. The hair on fire is not happening to replace graphite right now.
Right, right. There's not so much this urgency that, hey, we're going to run out. Or I want to ask, like, naturally, to the common person that's not very technical, they're not really heavily involved with the EV space or batteries in
Right.
general.
Right. Most people.
Most people, yeah,
Mhm.
like 99% of the people out there probably. When you say the words battery minerals, man, the reactions that a lot of people will get is, oh, child labor in the Congo and all of this, and you're destroying the environment through mining.
Right.
I mean, you've already said you guys aren't involved in mining itself, but I'm assuming that you have some sort of process in place to make sure that the companies that you're partnered with for the mining are doing so in an ethical way, as I guess not sustainably, because obviously if you're mining, it's not sustainable, but in a way to be as conscious about their environmental effect as possible.
Right.
You guys have certain processes or things that you do to really verify that where you're getting the source material from is done in such a way?
We do, so historically in the graphite universe, up until this point, I mean, 80% or more of all of graphite being used, particularly for EVs, has been mined in China. And of the rest of the graphite, 95 or more percent of it is is processed in China, right? So it's a very proven and well established ecosystem, in China. We actually have operations there, but you touch on a really important point, because one and again, this is not a shameless plug, but what I was brought on board to do is to bring that technology to the U.S. and on to other parts of the world, Europe, et cetera, as the electrification of mobility continues to proliferate, right? So, as part of that effort, we are sourcing materials now from other locations outside of China. Now, China's got the largest graphite deposit on the planet, right? It's an
Lucky
enormous
them.
asset. Now, there are other assets, there are other deposits really all over the world. Now, historically, mining graphite has not been that profitable, right? So, for all of the capital expenditure, the regulatory hurdles, et cetera, that a mining company would go through, and I know I'm speaking a little bit out of school here, not my area, but I think it's intuitively makes sense. For all of that effort and brain damage to build those plants, you might as well mine something else like
Right.
lithium or
Sure.
gold
Yeah.
or vanadium or something. So graphite mines are not ubiquitous. Now that's starting to change because of the demand, right? And let's just touch on the demand for a second. When you just consider in North America, the factories that have been announced to make EV batteries, right?
Oh yeah, plenty.
Point, to Elon's terms of gigafactories. What's been announced and what is currently kind of in the planning or even in construction phase represents a demand for graphite to feed those batteries of somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 tons a year of the refined graphite that we make. The current commercial capacity to refine that graphite in the States is zero right now, right? So we have a long way to go to domesticate critical mineral supply.
Say that, yeah.
And as part of that, we talk about, to answer your question, the sourcing of that. So we've aligned ourselves with many different mining operations, excuse me a second, that are outside of China. So Sierra Resources in Mozambique, they have the second largest asset, producing mine currently in the world. And we just announced recently an offtake agreement with Sierra. Northern Graphite up in Quebec, Canada, the only producing graphite mine in North America. We have an agreement with Northern, and we have several others with other companies that are developing, mining assets. And as we go through that, we obviously, investigate their ESG practices, their mining practices, their labor practices, et cetera, as we review our own, to domesticate this. So we don't want to just do it. We want to do it right, and we want to do it well, and we want to have partners that are doing it well, because we know there is, something of a microscope on it, and rightfully so, right? It is an industrial process, no getting around it, right? If you're extracting, raw materials from the earth, there will be, mechanical and chemical processes that are required. The challenge opportunity is to do it well and do it responsibly. And that technology has evolved, significantly, even in the course of my professional career, where it's done very well. Just a quick aside, I'm here in Northern California. I'm very close to Silicon Valley. Many of the same processes that are used on a large scale are used on a much more refined scale in the semiconductor business. So it's not areas that have not been addressed before,
sure,
from an environmental and sustainable, perspective.
Well, naturally, anytime you're talking about something that involves the climate or electric vehicles, everything has become so politicized these days that as much as I want to ignore politics and not have it be involved in really most of what I like to talk about, you have to at least acknowledge that part is there, because the majority of people, there's a lot of people that are so against any kind of progress related to addressing climate change or transitioning to electric vehicles on purely a political basis, where they never had a problem, for using graphite as an example, with any other application of the mineral. So I think that's important to point out that, okay, you had mentioned ESG value. For those that don't know what ESG stands for, it's environmental, social, and governance. Basically, there's, things that have to be taken into account. Obviously, you want to minimize your impact on the environment and keep, a lot of those other things in mind. I'm curious, I mean, if China kind of has the lion's share of capacity in terms of what they're able to provide, has the requirements, the mineral requirements as a part of the EV tax credit in the IRA, has that had an effect on your business in terms of where you're trying to source things? Like,
Sure.
were you trying to look at North America before that? Or was that really a big kind of finger on the button going, okay, yep, we need to start looking around a little bit, a little bit further.
I really appreciate the question, because we did announce in early 22 that we would be building a plant in Warren, Michigan. And that was before the real push came for, to domesticate and to move away, to separate from. And that was just a business decision. That was really, we saw, and that's, again, why I joined the company and why I was brought on board. was to drive this expansion, into the states. And again, that was before it really became fashionable, we'll say.
Right.
And what the things like the IRA and again these a lot of this geopolitical tension really did was to accelerate that. Accelerate our plans to make it more. It actually helped us in a large way to validate what we were doing. Right. Not that we needed validation, but from the investor community, et cetera. You know, the question when we first made the announcement was, well, why build in the U.S.? We know it's more expensive to operate here. Obviously, that's why there aren't any plants here.
Right.
Why are you doing that? Well, not to say that we were clairvoyant, but we did know that once you have demand, which again these gigafactories would represent, that it only makes sense from a supply chain that you want it to be as local as you can make it. Again, we don't do the mining, so we don't have to worry about where the graphite is located because miners obviously have to worry about that. You can only mine it where it exists. But as far as processing it, we knew that we could do that, closer to the point of use, which is always a good decision as long as you can do so, within pricing parameters and other, restrictions, or typical, supply demand dynamics. So we were a little bit ahead of the curve, and now we're finding ourselves right in the middle of things, and rightfully so.
Sure. And it's important to sometimes, I mean, luck will always play a role in everything that we do,
Sure.
but it's certainly, there's a lot of value in kind of looking ahead and analyzing what's going on and going, you know what, we need to make some adjustments and kind of focus on something. But then, like you said, you don't necessarily need the validation of that decision, but it doesn't hurt to have it.
It's nice. Yeah, it was nice. So now we play the game of saying like, hey, we were here first. We saw this coming.
Right.
Nobody saw all of it coming, but it only makes it. And we saw what happened with COVID and the disruption to the supply chain caused by there was zero shipping containers available.
Right. Yeah.
For a year, and those costs went up by 10x, or 15x.
Mhm.
So, knowing that was going to happen again, maybe not to that degree, but that there was always that chance of disruption. And let's face it, the Asian EV market is 15 years ahead of everywhere else, and it's not slowing down. So for all of the materials that are produced, sourced and refined in Asia, it's all going to get gobbled up over there.
Right.
So unless you have alternative sources of supply and refining capabilities elsewhere, you may have every intention of getting it from Asia, but it may not be coming from Asia.
Sure.
So again, we knew enough about that to make the moves that we made back in early 22.
Mhm. So a lot of talk about EV batteries specifically is towards end of life, not necessarily on the use, like reusing it in a different purpose, but towards recycling. Naturally, graphite is recyclable. Um, is there any part of what you guys do where you would receive material after it's already been in a battery that you then would refine it and it gets kind of in that cycle versus only sourcing from mines?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the graphite is recyclable. Unfortunately, it's not recyclable back into electric vehicle battery.
Okay.
Right. So at the end of life, again, it's a natural product. Even if it wasn't recycled, it's only going to go back to where it came from, basically, right? But that being said, graphite secondary uses can be not in an EV battery. It can be used maybe in a lower performance type battery, but more likely to be used as a coating or a lubricant, or something of that nature. But can be captured from that recycling process where there is a lot of focus, on it. And that's an important part of it. Unlike synthetic, which, synthetic graphite exists for a reason. It does have some some better swelling characteristics, for example.
Right.
But it's created from a byproduct of oil and gas, right? It's made from petroleum coke that is then put through a very energy intensive process, et cetera. So when you talk about ESG footprint, synthetic kind of misses the mark a little bit, in my humble opinion. And for an overall movement that's trying to move us away from fossil fuels, it seems a little bit of a half step backwards to rely then on a byproduct of fossil fuel to create electric vehicles. And I think that it provides fodder for some of the naysayers. But yeah, hopefully answered your question.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's an interesting point where you would think a synthetic graphite. The thought that I have is, before you said that, is, well, if this is created in a lab, then that allows us to be more flexible and creative with how it's put together. I'm curious. I mean, I don't know anything about the chemistry side of things. I'm not a chemist. I mean, high school chemistry is as far as I went into it. There are a lot of petroleum alternatives that are used for plastics and things like that. Has there been any talk in the industry about a synthetic graphite that isn't based with some sort of oil or petroleum source?
There is that element, there is that thread, that's percolating. And again, I think there's some R&D being put towards that. Not all graphites are created equal, right? Even synthetic, right?
Sure.
So even in the natural world, we get what we call flake graphite, usually from deposits that are typical, hard rock deposits. There is graphite, for example, is called alluvial graphite, and that's really not really capable of being used because of the crystalline structure.
Okay.
So similarly, on the synthetic side, the petroleum coke or the needle coke in specific is really what's used. Other sources of carbon, which is what graphite is, right? It's 100% carbon. Are being considered, but there's usually, and this is kind of getting to the limit of my knowledge as well. There are limits to why there are challenges to using it, and then it becomes a question of commercial, capability. If you can make it in a lab, that's one thing, right? If you can turn lead into gold, that would be great.
Right.
But if it costs 10 times what it takes to make it something else, and then the performance is only marginally better, then it just doesn't it doesn't make it out of the cradle.
Right.
A lot of that going on. There's a lot of levers to trip before you can occupy a spot, a very coveted spot within the battery chemistry, right?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, there is so much on the R&D side of things that might happen in a lab. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. I would expect. I mean, you're right there in the middle of the industry. But for the rest of us, like, we see, press releases. Oh, such and such company had this battery breakthrough. Right. And it's like, okay, well, that was a small handful in a lab. But then they never get to a point where it's commercially viable because they can't produce it on scale.
Right.
So, or for an affordable price. I mean, you said that a couple of times where it's got to be affordable, because especially for electric vehicles, batteries are already the most expensive part. The goal is to make it less expensive. So we might not get the best technology, the best battery chemistries, the best graphite or any other sourcing of minerals. We're going to get a compromise ultimately, because the market is going to dictate what people feel they are willing to pay for.
Yeah. And I think, it's a great point. And I think we'll see the same kind of evolution in electric vehicle technologies, both, just definitely around the battery, but, around the vehicle itself as well, like we did for internal combustion. I mean, again, I'm going to date myself one more time. when I was a teenager, we were working on cars, internal combustion, but we were adding things like superchargers and fuel injectors and whatnot. And that was like, state of the art, radical. Now it's table stakes because all we were doing really was making the engines more efficient, right? And now, like I said, almost every car fuel injected. It's turbo, all these things that, again, I think we'll see similar types of advancements over time, in the electric vehicle space, including battery chemistries. But it's going, in the battery chemistry itself. Again, you're talking about a very, I'll call it temperamental kind of reaction that goes on within each cell, and then you multiply that by 1,000 or 1,800, and controlling that, monitoring that, et cetera. You're not going to introduce radical new technologies into that quickly, right? So there is a lot of, and maybe I'm editorializing here a little bit, but a lot of the research and development is being done in these labs, and the only application for those is at the very, very high end, of vehicles, right? So Ferraris and those, and that's not going to electrify mobility for the masses,
right,
anytime soon. So it's going to be, that non-sexy kind of, work that's done, at the ground level to make the low-cost batteries more efficient and more cost-effective, et cetera. And that work is happening, right? But it's just not getting the notoriety.
Right. I mean, and generally, even within the EV community, the anode and graphite is not really what people talk about. I mean, one of the first things that you said in our conversation was, this isn't the sexy part of the battery.
Do you own a business and want to reach EV owners and people interested in electric vehicles? EV Resource is welcoming businesses nationwide, both big and small, to become advertising partners with us across all platforms. The EV Resource podcast, magazine, YouTube videos, social media, and our webpage. For more information, please email Zach at hello@ev-resource.com.
I'm curious about graphite's role in some of the more, I want to say, the characteristics of a battery when it comes to like having a higher C rate, or like really, really pushing for something that can charge and discharge very quickly. The consumer is demanding that a car can charge much more quickly than they do now. And certainly some makes and models are much more effective at that than others.
Right.
Does graphite really play a role in the ability of a battery to charge or discharge in a certain rate?
Yeah, I mean, it does, and that's one of the characteristics of silicon that is so attractive. It's a very, very fast charge and discharge. Even synthetic has a little bit better performance in that regard. So yeah, you will. That is the holy grail: is fast charge cycle and long duration. And historically, those two things kind of play against each other, and that's where the all of the work in the different battery configurations is coming into play. So you'll hear about lithium iron phosphate batteries being kind of the new darlings, if you will, because of their relatively lower costs in general terms, and safer, so to speak. Whether that's true or not, it depends on which stat you look at. But lithium iron phosphate uses a high level of synthetic graphite, as do some of the higher end electric vehicles that are $100,000 plus at this point. So graphite does play a role in that. It does store the charge right in the graphene layers of the graphite, and then of course the discharge rate is also important, and the ability to hold the charge, the energy density, is another kind of factor. So there, for every element in the battery is probably 10 different parameters that are considered, and some of them are trade-offs. right? So when we deal with and this is getting a little into the weeds, but one of the specifications that we are presented is for a particle size distribution that allows for a combination of fast charge and discharge and energy storage, right? So there's a lot of not experimentation, but a lot of tweaking that's done with the battery chemistries by the cell makers themselves to try and optimize performance. And they're looking at all of the different elements, all of the elements that are on the cathode side, what type of separator, what type of electrolyte, what's not only the anode material, for us, it's a specification of different particle sizes, et cetera. Then there's the additives. Then there's just so many things that go into it. And there really is no standardization at this point,
Right.
Like there eventually became with gasoline, right? You got your three choices at the pump, and all the car makers are aware of that. So there will be that evolution over time, but it's not here now.
Yeah, we're very still, even though the modern EV industry has been around for more than a decade at this point, we're still very, very much in its infancy. And I've had a number of people that I've talked with that describe it as still being the wild, wild west when it comes to the lack of standardization, even in the EV charging side of things. I mean, there are quote unquote standards, but I mean, there's so much variability even within that the complexity is, at least to somebody that has somewhat of a view of all of that, but then still I'm not in the trenches every day. It seems like absolute chaos. How do you guys keep up with what seems to be an ever changing environment within which to work? I mean, that's got to be quite the challenge.
It is for sure, and it's I think it's astute of you to pick up on that because and I have a tendency to look, it's kind of my job, right, to look at the overall landscape and say, where do we fit in, and where is the opportunity, both from obviously from a commercial standpoint, but also from a standpoint of being a foundational player and really, breaking it down to its basic components that what's really necessary here. And when you really think about what we're trying to do as a society here, two things at once, two major, I think, Herculean tasks, right? Electrify mobility, basically move away from 100 plus years of internal combustion technologies, infrastructure, manufacturing, et cetera. At the same time, domesticate the supply chain for that. So the whole paradigm has to shift, right? And it is doing so. To answer your question, it is a little bit of the Wild West because everybody's being pushed out of their comfort zone. And I'll start with the OEMs. They're used to going to an industry, a well-established industry of manufacturing all of their needs, right? Tires, engines, ball joints, et cetera. And they make a new model, they come up with a new specification. They put that spec out to an existing vibrant industry, and that industry responds almost immediately and says, we can make it. Here's what it'll take. Here's what it'll cost, and we'll be ready in whatever X amount of weeks. Now they're doing the same thing. We started building out this EV infrastructure by building the autos first, and now we're doing the batteries, and then we're going to the supply chain. So now the OEMs and the battery makers are putting out specs to an industry that doesn't exist. Right?
Sure.
It doesn't exist here in North America. So we as a company and as an industry are trying to respond to that gap and fill that gap as quickly as possible. But it is a different paradigm. And I think, like I said, everyone's coming out of their comfort zone. So for this to succeed, which it will, we know it's going in one direction. And that's something I can say from experience. There's never been an alignment of this magnitude between political will, the money that goes with that, and society acceptance, right? Even though it's not 100% on any of those fronts, it's very hard for anybody, any political stick in the mud to really hold back this tidal wave, right?
Yes.
You can throw darts at it, and some naysayers will do so and talk about what's the footprint, Well, if you compare the footprint of creating an electric vehicle and the battery, et cetera, to what it takes in a full view to extract dinosaur juice from the bottom of the ocean, ship it around, refine it, et cetera, and then build that car as well. It's night and day. I mean, it's not even close, right? So again, never seen this much of an alignment. So it's going to happen. It's going to be chunky. And what we're doing, as a company, is trying to be a good player in that environment and say, look, we know what role we play. We're going to stick to our knitting. We do what we do. We do it well. We've been doing it for a decade, and this is what the industry needs. So we're not going to be bringing anything radically new. We're going to bring what's needed to get this off the ground. So I contend, again, this is a shameless plug, but if you want to replace 100 years of technology, internal combustion to electric, and you want to domesticate that at the same time, find players that have been there before that are ready to plug and play. And I think we established that a year ago when we said we're going to build a plant in Michigan. Now, that'll be the first of probably many that we build. But that, unless you build out the middle piece of this, you're not going to get to that domestic supply. And that's going to be true for all of the critical minerals, chips, everything else. And we're seeing that effort, kind of afoot, now.
Yeah, it's very much like the Manhattan Project in terms of the public and private coordination, where everybody's kind of marching for the same purpose to accomplish the same goals. Now, and everybody has their piece of the puzzle that they're playing, like you were saying. What's interesting, though, is you made a point that I've not heard anybody else say before, that essentially we are thirsty, so now we're building the well versus building the well ahead of time, knowing that eventually we will be thirsty. We're starting with the end product of the vehicles and going, oh, we're going to need batteries, because I believe most OEMs at this point are supply constrained when it comes to battery cells in terms of being able to make the vehicles. We have lots of great announcements about wonderful vehicles that I'm sure are fantastic, but it takes years and years and years sometimes before we even see the vehicle hit the market. I think a lot of that is, to your point, because, well, we need the batteries. Well, where are we going to make the batteries? Well, now it has to be in the US if you want to have the tax credit a part of it. Okay, well, now we need all the minerals and mining and everything in North America, or a country that we have a free trade agreement with, which I have not even seen a full list of that. Like, it's... Right. I'm surprised that anybody is able to keep it all straight, honestly. Yeah. Like, there's so many moving pieces to this, and we are kind of going around about it backwards. I mean, that's an excellent way of explaining that, going, hey, what are we, like, did we get a little ahead of ourselves? And are we going to see somewhat of a pullback and a leveling out, but while we figure out how to put all the other pieces in play in order to scale production of vehicles? I suspect that we might. I mean, maybe Tesla aside, because I don't even know how they do it. But everybody else, you look at the production and delivery numbers for EVs, and they're, nowhere near where Tesla is in North America. So it's interesting that I think you hit the nail on the head there, where that probably is a big, big limiting factor. So, John, we need you.
I agree, Jack.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've said a lot to people that I really appreciate that the work that they're doing. In many ways, I could say that about what you and Graphex are doing, but almost to a point where you're not out there interacting with the end user of an electric vehicle.
Right.
You're very much kind of much earlier in the supply chain, but that there is no diminishing the importance of the role that you and Graphex are play as a part of this. Because without you guys, I mean, I want to avoid bringing up any competitors, but I mean, aside from Graphex, can you point out how many companies that are similar are operating within North America, or are you guys it?
No, I mean, and we're not operating yet, right? So our plant is not operational yet.
Okay,
Yeah. So
maybe a bad choice of word there.
well, I mean, just when I hear, I just gotta make sure people understand that. Now we are moving forward towards that, and I think
Mhm.
we're early movers, if not first movers, on a commercial scale. So there are several companies. I think all of them are mining operations that are now developing. We'll call the midstream muscle, right? So I refer to mining operations as upstream in the graphite world,
Okay,
and of course the OEMs and battery makers downstream. We
sure.
say midstream. So Sierra, and I mentioned them before, they have a huge mine in Mozambique. They have also are building out midstream capability down in Louisiana. They have a pilot, I believe, that's operational, or a pilot functioning, and then they'll be coming online in the next couple of years, I believe, with midstream. Nouveau Monde up in Canada, similarly, a mine not operational yet. The mine and their midstream is not operational yet, but they have plans of providing vertically integrated, from mine to battery. Our approach is, and Westwater similarly down in, I think they're in Alabama. They were previously a uranium mining company, but now they've switched over to graphite. None of those companies have commercial experience in the midstream, right? So that's one thing that we have that's a differentiator, and we tend to think it's a bigger one because
Experience goes a long way. Certainly.
we spent a couple of years burning in our processes and which I always say it's part art and part science. What we do, that shaping, purifying, coating. Remember, you're dealing with microscopic particles, 6 microns to 20 microns at the biggest. And you're refining those to meet very exacting specifications, right? So as far as the shape, the particle size, the coating, the thickness of the coating, et cetera, et cetera. So, we've been doing it for 10 years at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week kind of a scale. That's a huge leap going from pilot to that capability.
Mhm.
So, our direct competitors in North America are not quite online commercial scale, and they don't have the same level of experience. Other companies that have the same level of experience and are even much bigger than us are all China based.
Yep.
Right. And many of them are state owned or very intrinsic, or what do you want to call it? Intricately tied. So they're not really making any moves. You don't hear about them coming over here to the United States for many reasons, right? And even Ford trying to do the deal with CATL that you may have heard about,
Yes.
faced a lot of headwind around that because of the ties back to China. Again, similar to what I said about synthetic graphite, is it a step in the wrong direction? What we're trying to do is domesticate supply, break ties with China for geopolitical reasons and supply chain disruption, vulnerabilities, et cetera. So, why would you want to be tied back to it? So, we are, as a side note, we announced a couple of months ago that we are exploring. Right now, we're based in Hong Kong, our headquarters. We are exploring ways to do a separation so that there's no connection, back, so that we can avail ourselves of DOE money, DOD fundings. None of the OEMs have to be concerned about any tiebacks or whatever. So again, we're doing all the things that it takes to do what the stated objective is, which is to domesticate supply, from end to end. Now, the other differentiator that we've kind of alluded to with those other North American companies, they have their own mine, so therefore they have their own source of supply, and I think that's good. That could be a pro and a con, right? Because if there is a disruption in that mining, in that ecosystem, that could create a disruption downstream. Whereas if we have a diversified upstream supply, multiple sources of graphite coming from all over the world, that gives resiliency to that supply chain, and hopefully, a level of comfort to the end users that, if there's an issue that happens in Mozambique, that we can use graphite from Canada, right? Or vice versa. So, we think that is a long-term benefit to the industry, to have that diversified supply chain and to have access to multiple sources and not be tied to our own, our own mine.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, to be diversified, where there's a lot of talk about vertical integration being a massive advantage in the marketplace because you can control every step of the process. But that's a really good point that you've made, that sure, there's very clear benefits to that, but then also a potential risk, because if one part of that is removed somehow, well, now if you don't have a backup, if you don't have some sort of diversity to the supply and the processes that are involved, that I could foresee that people could get into some potentially troubling, or at worst case scenario, situations that would just result in them not being able to operate anymore.
Yeah,
Uh,
it can be, and we've seen it. Some of these assets are located in jurisdictions and within governments that are not going to sit idly by and not want to participate in the value that's being created. So that could manifest itself in different ways, some of which could be disruptive. If there's a mining operation in a certain country that is doing extremely well and the government is suffering, they may step in, and they could act in various ways, to either put a premium, a levy on the outputs,
oh,
or
sure.
want first right of refusal, or whatever. So you just don't know what, we don't want to go from the frying pan into the fire, as my grandmother would say, right?
Sure.
And move away from one geopolitical problem and align with what could turn out to be another one, either now or down the road. So
Mhm.
unless we're producing it right here in the good old US of A, which there's not a lot of graphite, here right now, not enough to supply this gaping demand.
So I got curious, and I actually Googled graphite sources in North America, and apparently, and you might already know this, but certainly the audience doesn't. Apparently, the largest known graphite deposit in the United States, anyway, is in Alaska. Well,
Hmm.
it's saying that there might be a little bit more than 10 million metric tons with a 7.8 to 8% graphite in that. Well, if that's the biggest, to the numbers that you had said earlier, by the time you end up refining that to the level that you all do, that's hardly touching what is going to be needed.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. You're right. Yeah, and that's true. And where it's located, I forgot to mention Graphite One. They're the I think that's who you might be referring to. Don't know much about where that asset is located, but I can only go back to when I worked at Siemens. My jurisdiction included Alaska,
Okay.
and those projects were limited to when you could when you could operate. So I know mining operations do up in Canada, they run through the winter, but I think Alaska is going to present some challenges, from a
Just a
logistics.
little bit.
Yeah.
The map it's showing me it looks like it's an island in the Bering Strait. Like,
Okay.
a, a, I mean, that might be almost to the Arctic Circle. Like, just, I can't imagine wintertime
Yeah.
negative whatever degrees. Like, no thanks. I'll let them do the work. I want no part of that.
Right.
Some other spots that I'm just seeing, just while I have it up, are in Colorado, Montana, Alabama, Texas, very small in eastern Pennsylvania, and then the eastern part in the Adirondack Mountains of New York.
Right.
So they're out there, but certainly It's so much of the process of getting it, bringing it out of the ground, and providing it to you all for you to do your magic and send it on its way downstream in the supply chain. I like that. I'm gonna steal that. Well, John, I've got two questions I've started to ask my guests.
Oh boy.
The first is, no, these are easy. The first is, what do you drive? What vehicle do you typically choose to run around in every day?
I actually don't drive that much because I have the ability to work here from home. So,
Okay.
when I do travel, I usually call for a service and ask them if they can provide an electric vehicle. I ride my bike quite a bit. Where I go to local stores here, and I'm on a list for an electric vehicle. It's taking a while to get, but
Okay. Are you able to reveal which electric vehicle?
I don't think I should
Okay.
because of my position.
That's perfectly fine. The second question is somewhat of a play on the word drive, where I asked you what you drive. What drives you in terms of when you get up in the morning? What is it that's really the big motivator behind who you are and pushing you to accomplish what you want to do?
Yeah. So I've always been, kind of driven to solve complex type problems. And, for better or worse, I always seem to find myself in these positions like we are, and you alluded to it earlier, this Wild West type of an environment where in on the macro scale, you can kind of see what the right things to do are and what the answer is. But you have to navigate a dynamic environment where not everybody is of the same level of awareness. There's a lot of factors that are driving things. I mentioned earlier that my role in this energy transition has always felt like pushing a rock uphill, right? Because as much as we knew that a particular entity, whether it was a government or a university, would benefit by doing a total energy kind of revamp, a campus transformation, let's say. It was almost incredible how many obstacles would get thrown in the way, by what seemed like kind of to someone who's driven by this seemed like kind of silly reasons, right? Political pressures, or not in the backyard, or that's too much work, or whatever. So it's that similar kind of navigating a very dynamic environment, knowing that the end result is going to benefit everybody, and just trying to get everyone, kind of on board with that. So that goes with, not so much internal, because everybody's definitely on board, within Graphex, but when you're navigating with, OEMs and mining operations and regulatory, investment people, et cetera, trying to get everyone to share the vision and to first of all understand the problem and what the solution is and what role we play in doing that. So I spend a lot of time, having conversations similar to this one, to kind of explain again, what's the problem? Where's the deficit? Why does this matter? Why are we talking about graphite? And if we're talking about graphite, why are we talking about Graphex? Right.
Right.
So I would say, if you believe in electrification needs batteries. Batteries need graphite. And when you think about graphite, Graphex is the answer, right?
Sold. Awesome. I want to thank you for your time and your experience and being willing to come on and help educate people about not only the industry, and your role in that, but then just the specifics about Graphex and the work that you guys are doing to allow the rest of us to enjoy driving our electric vehicles. So I
Yeah.
want to thank you very much.
Yep, it's a pleasure to be with you. We're happy to be playing a role here. We do think that I'm finally able to describe to my kids, what I do and how it has a bearing, on the future, and feel good about it.
All right, it's time now for the EV Resource Hotline segment. This is your chance to be featured on the podcast and share your EV question, comment, or discussion topic. If you have something that you want to talk about, I want to hear all about it. there are two easy ways to call in. You can use your smartphone's built-in voice recorder and record a message that's 90 seconds or less in the interest of time, and then email that file to me at hello@ev-resource.com. Alternatively, you can take that same message and call into the EV Resource hotline, which is a toll-free number. You can access that voicemail day or night and leave a message. That phone number is 1-844-387-2428. Again, that's 1-844-EVR-CHAT. And if you know someone special with an upcoming birthday, anniversary, graduation, or other special occasion, you can give them the unique gift of recorded voices from friends and family telling them why they are special. The recordings can be podcasted or put onto a keepsake. For more information, go to lifeonrecord.com or click the link in the show notes. I want to thank the EV Resource family of Patreon supporters. Patreon is a platform that allows you to support creators directly in exchange for various perks, and it is one of the ways that EV Resource is funded. So I definitely am very appreciative of all the people that support EV Resource and my efforts. At the top tier, the director tier, I want to thank Rajeev, Narayan, and Andy Cooper. At the executive producer tier, Christopher Lawrence, and at the producer tier, Charles Hall, Eric Weber, Bruce Gallant, and Tony Stuntz. Also, thank you to all the other Patreon supporters that choose to support at their various chosen custom levels. And if you're interested in ad-free episodes of the podcast, EV Resource merch, direct access to me via email, Zoom, or otherwise, or you just want to help support my efforts and make EV Resource better, then I strongly encourage you to go to patreon.com/EV Resource and consider joining the growing Patreon family. And if you're not quite there yet, that's perfectly okay. It's optional 100%. I do have other ways that you can support EV Resource and get some sweet deals on products that you love. I have partnered with a lot of major brands through affiliate and advertising partnerships to bring you the latest deals, exclusive discounts, and special offers from brands like TireRack.com, Goodyear Tires, Ghirardelli Chocolates, NordVPN, OMU lithium-ion batteries, which actually is a very popular one, go figure, for an EV podcast. But there is a lot more, so you can go to ev-resource.com/deals. I invite your feedback via email to hello@ev-resource.com. And I want to thank you so much for watching and listening. And I'll see you next episode for the 2023 recap and 2024 predictions episode.